Hi guys, so today's video is going to be part 1 of what I'm hoping will be a 5-part video series. In this part 1, we are talking about the cons, the negative things, the worst things about the adult fantasy, and maybe a little bit science fiction genre. The following parts are going to be the worst things for young adult science fiction fantasy, and then we're going to be talking about the best things, and then eventually I want to do a versus video where I compare the best and the worst things so that we can kind of get an idea of how much do we really love one or the other, those sorts of things. And this is all based on what you all submitted on my Instagram stories. I asked you for this particular one, we're going to be talking about the worst things about adult fantasy, and you all gave me your thoughts on this. There were a lot of responses, and some of them are kind of similar, so I'm going to try to go through as many as possible. I'm sorry if I don't get to yours, but if you're wanting to vote on the best things about these genres/age ranges, my Instagram is ebnovels. Jumping into the juicy stuff though, which is the worst parts about adult science fiction and fantasy, the first one says, too complex. I don't want to have to take notes to keep up. Maybe I'm dumb, I don't know. For a lot of these, I'll provide some of my thoughts on them. With this particular one, I know who this person is too, and I don't think you're dumb at all. I actually totally agree. I don't think all adult fantasy is too complex, but I think there's this strange thing that's developed where the more complex, the more praiseworthy it is, as if in order for something to have a fantastic world or for the world building to be considered good, it has to be extremely complex or the magic has to be extremely complex. There's nothing wrong if you like complex magic and worlds and politics and things like that, but it's just, I find that if too many people value, not too many people, as many people as want to value that can value that, but I just hope that authors don't continuously think that's what they have to do, because eventually adult fantasy would get boring if everything was super, super complex all the time. Of course, there are some stories that aren't really complex whatsoever, but I'm just thinking of Malazan and how much people really love how complex and full that story is and how much is going on. I have heard people say like, oh, you get ready to take notes. I don't know. I have a lot going on in my life. The next one says the romance written wrong. That was actually, I saw a lot of people commenting on romance and adult fantasy. You know, there are some romances in adult fantasy that I ship. There's some people that I think are great, but there's also a lot of weird stuff in adult fantasy. There's some interesting relationships, and I think a lot of people instinctively, I know this isn't the one for young adult, but I think a lot of people with young adult fantasy are like, oh, the romances, they're so cringy and things like that. But honestly, I think that the romances in young adult are better. I also think people have this idea that there's just tons of romance in young adult and there's none in adult, but most big adult fantasy stories have love interests or have characters that are involved with one another romantically. And so I guess I don't really know where that idea comes from, that somehow like young adult has tons of romance and adult doesn't, and that adult, when it does have it, it's good, because I read a lot of both, and I gotta say, I think sometimes young adult does the romances better. The next one says it's hard to find decent standalones. I would have to agree with that. I think in general with fantasy and science fiction, it's hard to find good standalones. If I had to recommend one, I would recommend Warbreaker. I recommend it all the time, but because I think it's really great. The next one says small petty arguments between characters taking the place of actual conflict. You know, it's interesting. I would think that would, I haven't looked at the young adult ones yet. I have a feeling there's going to be a similar thing in the young adult ones. But in general, I don't know how much I feel that's just prevalent in adult fantasy. I think that's prevalent in a lot of genres and age ranges, and yeah, I agree, it's annoying. It definitely happens, but I don't know if I think it's that exclusive to this particular age range and genre. I'm gonna get tired of saying age range and genre, so I'm just probably gonna say genre. Just, you guys know what I'm talking about. The next one says names that can hardly be pronounced, and I really try my best. That's precious. It's really sweet that you try really hard. I gotta say, when I get around to a word, not a word, but a name that I'm like, I don't know how to say that. And if I don't have the audiobook, I just eventually, I shorten it and I make something up, and then that's what that character's name is in my head. And then when I do book reviews, I try really hard to avoid saying that character's name. So the next one says sexism. There's also another one right after that I'll put up on the screen because I think it's really funny. And yeah, I wish I didn't agree with this. I wish I was like, no, I don't think there's any sexism, because and maybe this is just in my head, I feel like as a girl to say, yeah, it feels like sometimes, not all the time, of course, but as a girl saying it felt a little sexist, or yeah, it maybe felt a little offensive toward women. It just feels like, I don't know, that people are going to be like, oh, dumb feminist, SJW. However, I am not so afraid of backlash that I'm not going to admit that, yes, I do think the adult fantasy genre has quite the issue with, man, the amount of violence against women and rape and things like that. It's not that that stuff isn't real and that it doesn't exist, because it absolutely exists. It's a real fear for so many people, not just women, men too, but women, you know, a lot of us, that there's a lot of things we're afraid of just basically because we're girls. And so it's not that when I see it in an adult fantasy book, I'm like, oh no, ugh, this is so sexist. It's not that. It's the way that things are constantly handled. And it feels like so often it's handled poorly. And then on top of that, there's also just the objectification of women in books. And I'm not by any means saying it's only male authors that are doing this. Sometimes female authors do it too. And it's all about how it's done. If there's a character who is very comfortable being a very sexual person, then that's their character and that makes sense. But if they're a character who is just a person who happens to be female, and then we got to describe the shape of them all the time, I mean, it happens. The next one says, sometimes the slow pacing, the sudden out of nowhere romance, which is usually cringe. You want to know what book comes to mind when I think of this? Wheel of Time. Sorry, Wheel of Time fans. But there's a character who is, there's like a female that's around them, and they're like, her nose looks like a beak. She's kind of hawkish looking. And then out of nowhere, something happens, and all of a sudden it's like, I'm in love with this person. And you're just like, what? Oh, okay, I guess the development went out the window for this relationship. It's not the only story to do that. It's just a thought of mine. Also in Malazan, I remember in a vlog, I was doing an update, and I talked about how there was a character out of nowhere, they're like professing their love for each other. And it was so underdeveloped that I was like, what's happening? However, I think that this is present in a lot of stories. It's present in contemporary, in young adult, in every historical fiction. It's present in pretty much every genre. This next one says lazy world building. I find this comment very interesting. I would love if the person who left this, if you felt comfortable enough to elaborate, I would love for you to elaborate. I know on the Instagram stories thing, a lot of times you don't have a lot of space to leave a really in-depth comment. But if you're watching this, definitely let me know what you're talking about, because this might be the first one that I disagree with. The next one says trying to be adult with descriptive sex scenes instead of complex plot. My husband and I were just talking about this. We were talking about the fact that it's very interesting that there are some people that totally stick their noses up at young adult, but then adult fantasy, they're like, oh yeah, it's so good. When sometimes the prose is not any better, and the only thing that's like separating certain, not all, but some adult fantasy is that there are more explicit scenes, whether that be sexual content or violence. I think it's interesting that sometimes it feels like that's the only thing that's separating it from being young adult. The next one says plot over characters is a no-no for me. I like your use of no-no. Yeah, I actually would say I find more character-driven stories in young adult than in adult, because sometimes the world is so big and the mission is so like, we have to save the world, that sometimes I feel like getting to know the characters kind of takes a back seat. That's not always the case. I mean, Joe Abercrombie's First Law series is totally character driven to the point where sometimes I'm like, what is the plot? Which is cool, and I like that. It's not for everybody. The next one says that the covers aren't as pretty as young adult. You know what? I 100% agree with this. I think that's not necessarily true for me with special editions or UK covers, but on average, I actually do think a lot of young adult covers are very gorgeous. Sometimes part of me is like, oh, it's shallow to care. But you know what? Somebody worked hard on the cover, and I don't feel like those artists should be just not really, that they're their efforts shouldn't be recognized. There were definitely quite a few that touched on the fact that adult is often very long. And you know what? I agree with that. It is sometimes very long. I don't mind long if I feel like everything is pertinent and important. But man, sometimes I'm like, how many descriptions of the Shattered Plains are we gonna get, Brandon? And I love Stormlight Archive, but sometimes I'm like, oh man, I understand what the Shattered Plains look like. One person said none, that there's nothing wrong, that there's nothing they don't like about adult fantasy. If you're one of those people, I'm very curious your thoughts on the things other people have mentioned. This next one says, forced complexity. People seem to think it has to be complicated, otherwise it's young adult. I agree with this. We kind of touched on this earlier. I think a good example of a story that's not overly complex, even though I didn't care for it, would be The Lies of Locke Lamora. Not overly complex, and a lot of people really enjoy it, and a lot of people really enjoy the characters and the relationship building. The next one says, lack of female and LGBTQ representation. I think that is true for a lot of genres, and I think that we're getting there. This is obviously not true of with young adult, we get mostly females, and it's the opposite. We get hardly any male protagonists. But as far as LGBTQ or people with disabilities, I think it's true that, you know, there's some things that could be more varied with a lot of books and a lot of genres, and hopefully we'll move forward and get there. The next one says, when the landscape is described pages after pages. Yes, talked about that before. I mean, sometimes people are like, I know that it's the ocean, but like, what does the ocean look like? What do the mountains look like? I'm like, they look like mountains. You tell me they're in a mountain landscape and that it's like a struggle, and I'm like, oh, okay, I can picture that. And then people are like, the mountains, they're very rocky mountains, and also the mountains are brown. And unless the mountains are purple or pink or have something cool about them, yeah, I don't need pages and pages and pages of descriptions. I'm 100% with you. That's it for now. A lot of the other responses are quite similar to ones I have already read and touched on. And I just want to reiterate, in case anybody's unsure, I love adult fantasy. It has some of my absolute favorite stories in it. But I think it's good to look at the things that as a group, we collectively are like, hey, maybe this could be better, because otherwise stories are going to stay the same, or certain things that we maybe aren't fans of, I don't know, we might continue to see that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with voicing what we would love to change. But yeah, I just feel like some of these, a lot of you pointed out some things that are likely very true, or that a lot of you agree with each other about. I'd be very curious to see all of your thoughts on this in the comments down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.